Hey everyone, I just wanted to make a few quick comments at the end of our discussion, the second discussion. Once again, you all did very well at responding to each other in a collegial tone and, for the most part, in using evidence from the readings and videos to support your ideas. Be sure that you always remember to do that and also think about um, the things we've been talking about in terms of reading other people's written history. And so we're critical of people's biases, we're critical of the way the authors use their sources, the kinds of interpretations they draw. Make sure you think about that as you draft your own responses as well, because you're doing the same thing in those responses. You're drawing on historical evidence and making interpretations in order to answer the questions that you've posed to one another about the material that we've been covering. Um, so with that in mind, also think about not just throwing in quotes from the readings, but making sure that you contextualize them and also explain their significance and how they have helped you to draw your conclusions about the way you're answering the question that you're responding to. I hope that all makes sense. Um, for the most part in this discussion, we touched on a couple of things from Unit 3, but mostly focused on Unit 4, particularly with the Santa Fe trade. Most of the questions related to the trade and to Bent's Fort. I'm glad that Bent's Fort in that video were so engaging for so many of you. As so many of you pointed out, Bent's Fort was an important place where people of different ethnic backgrounds came together during the Mexican period of New Mexico, at least from the perspective of New Mexico's history. We're looking at that period between 1821 and the U.S.-Mexico War. Also, something to keep in mind is the way that Bent's Fort also was limited in terms of who it reached, what kinds of people had access to trade there, and how, a couple of you had pointed out as well, how the Santa Fe trade really benefited the Rico class, those with political and economic power in New Mexico, but not so much those people who were living in the Genízaro communities of Abiquiu, places like Truchas, Peñasco. Those people were more or less left out, and some of the impositions by those in power, not just for Mexico in terms of that federalist-centralist divide that hit the fan in 1836 and 1837, but also in terms of people more locally, like Governor Manuel Armijo. We saw Padre Martinez was very critical of him in terms of his very liberal giving out of land grants to American newcomers who were part of the Santa Fe trade. Part of the reason that was so controversial is that people who had been living in this area for a long time, who had been holding, at least as they consider it, holding the line of civilization against Utes and Apaches and Navajos, they were left out. They weren't getting those land grants. They weren't getting access to the new trade goods that came along because they didn't have the same ability to pay, because they weren't part of that same kind of newfound capitalist system. So it's important to realize what the limitations were once again, and I think that helps us better understand why Charles Bent, when he was governor after Kearny had occupied, or Kearny's forces had occupied New Mexico, it seemed to make sense to have Charles Bent as governor in terms of his lasting relationships with people in New Mexico in the Southwest due to trade at Bent's Fort. Yet at the same time, we see that he was brutally murdered in the Taos Revolt of 1847. That was a function of those limitations that I was talking about, but also a function of the fact that Mexico was at war with the United States. And a few of the things we didn't delve into as much in this discussion were the questions about perspective in terms of why this war, this conflict, is called the War of North American Invasion still in Mexico. And here in the United States, we remember it as, more blandly as the U.S.-Mexico War, the Mexican-American War. What do those distinctions mean? Why are those perspectives important? I want to offer some extra credit, about 50 points extra credit, to respond to either that question or the question of why why the notion that Nuevo Mexicanos were not resistant to American occupation has been so prevalent in the historical literature and in historical studies. In the e-text and in New Mexican Lives, we saw that Nuevo Mexicanos actually very actively resisted the American occupation. They took part in the war effort. So address that question of why that story isn't told. Why is this usually referred to as a peaceful American occupation of New Mexico in 1846, when in reality there was a lot of resistance, war was going on? So I'm going to post this as an announcement. I'm also going to post it on the discussion board for extra credit. You can respond to the posting on the discussion board. Just reply. Make sure that you cite evidence from the readings and the films in your ideas and your responses if you want to take this opportunity to either address that question of perspective about the title of the war on both sides of the border, or the question of why that notion of peaceful conquest or peaceful occupation in 1846 has been so prevalent. So hopefully you enjoyed this discussion looking at this period in New Mexico's past, and I'm already looking forward to discussing the territorial period in Unit 5 with you as well over the next couple of days.